Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this webinar on the planning system. My name is Nick Sanford and we're joined today by over 100 CLA members, including estates, farms and business professionals. One of those professional firms is Saunders, who have sponsored this event, and we're joined by Angus Hudson, the founder and managing director, and Hazel Izod, a planner. We also have Alison Provis, the regional surveyor, who deals a great deal with planning matters, as well as all the other things that come across the desk of a CLA advisor. Planning is the key to so many opportunities for rural businesses, yet so often it's a source of frustration and failure. Despite CLA lobbying and many successes, there are delays and frequent problems. But if you get it right, so many benefits can flow for your business. We have a series of videos and on case studies. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A session. At the end of the time, there will be a time for questions. The session is being recorded, and now I hand over to Alison to give us an update on the CLA and planning matters. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Nick. So welcome everybody to our webinar on planning. Just to sort of set some background, planning inquiries make up a lot of the work that we do at the CLA in terms of advisory work. And sometimes we're approached at the beginning of projects where we can help members sort of navigate through the proposals. But sometimes we do often find ourselves advising on how to help members get out of pickles that they might have got themselves into. So we thought it would be helpful just to have a planning webinar to cover off some of the main and common sort of issues that members see in terms of planning applications, but also to sort of flag the key message that is really to sort of seek professional advice as soon as you can. As soon as you have some concept or something, some proposal that's been drawn up, seek advice at the earliest opportunity rather than sort of at a later stage where perhaps we can't sort of help so much as we could at the beginning. And also it is important to have a really good team around you once those proposals are sort of a bit more concrete and to be taken forward, then having those advisors there to help with that. So I also just wanted to very briefly update in terms of planning policy and the CLA's work on that. So I'm sure everybody is aware of the Queen's speech a couple of weeks ago and the planning bill that was in that. So that planning bill, quite light on detail, but just as a brief overview, it sort of brought forward the planning white paper reforms, the main elements of which is zoning. I'm sure most of you have heard that concept, into growth zones, possibly renewal zones and protected zones. It also introduced some other elements, including replacing the community infrastructure levy, CIL, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. So the CLA's position on the Queen's speech, we welcome the modernisation of the planning system. I'm sure, well, hopefully most of you have seen our work in terms of the Rural Powerhouse campaign and our policy paper on simplifying the planning system and making it work for the rural economy. Those papers are available on our website, but if you'd like to look through them as well, please do contact the office. But ultimately, the protected area concept still remains a huge concern for the CLA, and that's something which we're working very hard to address. We've been writing to the Housing Minister, Christopher Pincher, and also the PM on these elements and making sure that with protected areas, they're not preserved in aspect. So they're not sort of preserved as a museum type concept, really. So that's the work that we've been doing recently on planning. Any questions on that? Any policy papers you're interested in or consultation responses? Because there have been several government consultations over the last 18 months or so. Please do get in touch with the regional office and we'd be very happy to share those and chat anything through with you in relation to that. So if I move on now to our planning webinar, there'll be 3 videos, case studies, which we'll be looking through, and then myself, together with Angus and Hazel, will be having a chat through the concepts and some of the issues that have been raised in each video. So at the CLA, we often get members contacting us regarding a variety of different diversification projects. most of which, well, some of which are looking to tap into the tourism sector, for example, bed and breakfast, glamping, camping, that sort of thing. But with any project, it's important to give consideration to the project from the start and make sure that you're up to speed in terms of your locality, market research and planning policy. So for our first case study, we're visiting Manor Farm in Warwickshire, where the Morton family are looking to build 3 holiday cabins next to a fishing lake, and also take a look at the planning process that these CLA members went through. Thank you.
My father came here in 1952. We live about 6 miles away, and we've been farming this land as a partnership since the early 80s. This lake here was created in the 80s for fishing. My father reinstated this and created all the trees here. We're going to build 3 cabins, 1-bedroom cabins. They'll be very comfortable, but not luxurious. We've always been very into conservation and creating habitats. We've done a huge amount of biodiversity over the years with the OELS scheme and the HL higher level scheme. We do pollen and nectar and wild bird mixtures. That has just ended on the 31st of March, so we're about to go into a countryside stewardship scheme, and by doing the cabins here and opening up for tourism, we're going to do tours around the farm and walks.
First and foremost, as a planner, we always look at the principle. Will the principle be supported by the local authority? It's quite clear in national policy that there's support for prosperous rural economy and the sustainable growth and expansion of rural businesses through diversification and through rural tourism. So I think, you know, that ticks boxes. In terms of local policy, again, that was very much in conformity with national policy, and the council do support diversification of farming businesses and rural tourism. I think, you know, we had to look at the locality, the context of the site. We also had to look at the wider context. You know, was this the place to have holiday accommodation? Was there, you know, existing facilities, amenities, things for people to be doing? Would people be attracted here? So those were kind of the first things we needed to look at. In terms of the site and looking at the kind of constraints, we had a few things we needed to consider there. So one of the big things that came out from us doing a bit of research was actually the site is located within flood zones 2 and 3, and obviously any residential use is deemed vulnerable within those zones. So we spent a bit of time with a consultant looking at that. We did a bit of modelling, and that modelling work actually showed us that parts of the site were located in flood zone 1. So we were able to look at where those bits of the site were, and that actually determined where the lodges would be located. So that was quite a fundamental piece of work.
When we put in for planning, we had to have, firstly, we had to have support from the local community, that they were happy with the idea that we'd come up with. And also we needed to establish that there was actually a need for it, because a project like this, obviously there's a fairly large investment, and it's important that we feel it's something that's going to give us a viable income at the end of it. For the RPA grant, we had to do quite extensive market research. We had to investigate what other establishments there were in the area offering the same thing that we plan to offer. We feel the most important thing we need to do is to offer this as something which is unique, and offering access to the farm and the conservation that we're doing, and allowing people to actually experience firsthand how a farm can operate in a very conservation-minded way, embracing biodiversity and embracing wildlife habitats. It's really, that I think is our absolute unique selling point. It has always been very much that we want to farm in a regenerative way. We want to farm with ecology and in an ecologically sound way. And I think that the fact that that was at the centre of everything we were doing, I think, did help our case very much.
Excellent, thanks ever so much. Okay, so welcome Angus and Hazel. Thanks ever so much for joining us this afternoon to chat through these planning case studies we filmed. So Hazel, just to kick us off, in the first clip, Naomi talked about the first and foremost consideration being is the proposal supported in principle? How might somebody go about sort of looking into that and seeing if their decisions and proposals were going to work in terms of planning policy?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, it's important first to establish whether what you're proposing, your use or your proposed development, is actually appropriate in that location. And the principle is as set out in national and local policy. So it's important to look at that particular underlying principle before getting carried away with some of the detail. And if in any doubt about the principle of development, then certainly we'd recommend speaking to a planner and seeking some advice. In some cases, it is very much a factual assessment, such as in this case with Manor Farm, that there is support for tourism and leisure type uses in the rural area. And that's as set out in national and local policy. If you're in, say, the Greenbelt, for example, it's also quite black and white, but not as straightforward. In other cases, it is a bit more subjective when it comes to principle of development. We at Saunders certainly find ourselves dealing with quite a few housing proposals in areas sort of outside of village boundaries, etc., where the issue of sustainability comes into play. And that is the principle that we also need to establish. So, if there is any doubt about whether your proposals will be supported in principle first, then we would recommend seeking some pre-application advice from the local authority.
That's excellent. And I think one thing which I often sort of come across with members is the different layers of planning policy, and that some sort of can get quite confused as to the different sort of elements. So we have the national planning policy, we have local planning policy, some areas have neighbourhood plans, for example. So can you just sort of chat us through the sort of interaction between all of those different elements and what members would need to be looking at? Is it all of them? Should they all be sort of mirroring each other, or how does that work?
Yes, of course. So national policy, that's the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, which came into play in 2012 and replaced a whole suite of planning policy statements and guidance notes, tried to simplify the system, as they often do. So that is sort of the overarching policy approach for England. Now, you have your local plans that need to be consistent with the National Planning Policy Framework, and then you have your neighbourhood plans, which need to be consistent with the local plans. So at each stage, you need that consistency, but they can add in some additional detail. So it's important to be aware of the requirements of each of those policies. In terms of national policy, say in this example, we've got clear support for diversification and supporting sort of prosperous rural economy. Some members may be particularly familiar with paragraphs 83 and 84 of the NPPF that specifically support diversification, sustainable rural tourism. And quite importantly, at paragraph 84 is a recognition that particular sites for rural development may need to be found in locations that aren't within the settlements and that aren't as well served by public transport. And unfortunately, at local authority level, we still find a bit of a battle there in terms of sustainability justification for rural economic development and diversification schemes. So the local policy has to be in conformity with national policy, but that is the statutory basis for determining planning applications and appeals. So the legislation clearly says that your development plan is the starting point for decision making. So your development plan includes your local plan, which is at your local authority level, any neighbourhood plan that has been adopted, and in some cases you have minerals and waste type local plans from a sort of county council level. So that is the statutory basis for determining planning applications and appeals, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And that covers the whole realm of additional documents. Sometimes you have supplementary planning documents and guidance notes, etc. But importantly, the NPPF at that point is a material consideration. So in a lot of cases, you may be aware that local authorities are still in transition with their local plans. Some of them have expired many years ago. We have one local to us that's been out of date longer than it was in date. So the local authorities are still in the process of replacing their local plans with new plans that need to comply with the NPPF. So in a lot of cases, the NPPF will carry weight as their local policies aren't in conformity any longer. So it is a bit of a complex interaction and layers between the policies, but it is important to remember that the starting point is your local plan, your development plan, unless it is, say, out of date or inconsistent.
Excellent, that's really helpful, thank you. And one point that I thought was really interesting that Eleanor raised was the engagement and consultation with the local community. We often find that, you know, some developments on proposals don't get the support of communities, for example. So what would be your advice to members in terms of that side of things and making sure they bring the sort of community with them on a project?
Yeah. We find it probably depends on how remote you are, your relationship, your distance from neighbours, as to how involved you want to be with the community and consulting with neighbours and parish council, etc. I think if there is any risk of issues arising, any chance of an impact on any particular neighbours and the community showing an interest in your proposal, then we would always recommend early consultation with those neighbours and potentially with the parish council and local members, and try and minimise and avoid conflicts from arising at a later date, because your planning applications, once you get to that stage, are subject to a statutory consultation period, and at that point the council will advertise the application, may write to your neighbours, and the parish council will be notified. So if you're feel that there may be some controversy within what you're proposing, then it really is helpful to try and get them on board and explain the proposals from an early stage in the process. Obviously, if objections are received, that doesn't mean that a planning application will be refused, but obviously it's best to try and minimise any objections to a planning application, and ideally get some letters of support. I've got one at the moment, an appeal hearing, where we had no letters of support for the application process, but we're working with the client, have actually sort of presented to the local community explaining the appeal, and now have 27 letters of support, which will all help weigh in favour of a particular scheme. So it is important to engage at an early stage.
So definitely worth doing by the sounds of it. That's a success right there. Thanks ever so much, Hazel. Angus, just on the video, Naomi mentioned looking at the locality and the context of the site. What are you looking for when sort of appraising sites? Obviously, I know it depends on if it's leisure use or something else, but, you know, broadly speaking, what sort of elements and factors are you looking at?
A variety of factors, and as you say, I mean, in this case, it's a leisure use with accommodation, 3 lodges, and the setting, the opportunity to provide a destination. So it's a rural, semi-rural setting next to a quiet hamlet of Draycote Village. But it's within close proximity to Draycote Water, which is a 650-acre reservoir that has sailing on it and has a 5-mile cycle track around. So, and probably most importantly for some people, McDonald's is just up the road in the other direction. No, if you're looking at a large-scale scheme or conversions and buildings for a major commercial use, B8, storage and distribution, then access can be key. If you're looking for something that might be noisy, being away from neighbours. So it's judging the proposal, judging the setting. And one of the things that quite often comes out of these earlier stage appraisals is the client has a focus on a particular aim, and we always consider their objectives, discuss them with them. And occasionally we point out that actually there's a difficulty in doing that. And if we can overcome the constraints, great. But if not, sometimes there are other opportunities. So we switched a large-scale leisure scheme into a large-scale garden village to support a deficit in a local authority that were considering garden villages of that scale, and that's gained traction as being considered as one of 3 now. So it started off as an upmarket competitor to Centre Parks, and it switched to residential, which potentially, in the current circumstances, looks easier than the leisure scheme may have been.
Absolutely. And I think, again, we mentioned in the video about sort of restrictions on flood zone, for example, and that sort of having to influence the proposals and locations as to where they were siting the cabins. So again, yeah, constraints like that and designations, Hazel mentioned Greenbelt a moment ago, all of those sort of factors need to be considered, don't they, to make sure that what you're proposing is going to be a, you know, could be a flyer, basically. Eleanor also mentioned the importance of research and sort of making sure there's a need for your proposal. What advice would you give to others sort of in relation to that, making sure that you have the evidence to support your scheme, and yeah, that you have the evidence there to make sure that it is workable?
It's of its importance from a viability perspective, and the Morton family, as kind of was seen on the video, they did a lot of work. They were very focused. They got a vision for this site and where it fitted, where the lodges would fit in relation to their farm and what they're planning to do anyway. That's always helpful. Some clients come to us and say, I've got this set of buildings, or I'm sitting next to a town, what would you recommend? And sometimes the blank canvas is the easier approach for an agent, but it's always worth looking at the bigger picture and looking at the context and the opportunities there are. So market research is key. If there's a site just up the road that's also accommodation, the wider market sets the context, and it's not important. It's not so important. If you're opening a fish and chip shop next to a fish and chip shop, then that is a specific reason for not opening one, perhaps, when one does market research. So it all depends on the use.
Yeah, perfect, super. Thank you ever so much. So if we move on to our next video now, this one is to do with residential, and it's regarding redundant farm buildings that no longer meet the needs for modern agricultural practices. They can often sit empty, but with vision, investment, and in some cases a healthy dose of resolve, they can provide a wide range of opportunities to diversify your income. In this second case study, we travel to Norfolk to see how CLA member Will Sargent has secured planning permission to convert a number of redundant listed farm buildings into residential properties.
Here at Wood Farm, you're in a plot of approximately 6 acres. You've got a grade 2 listed farmhouse in need of full refurbishment. You've got this farm we're standing in now, which is about a 2,300 square foot hay barn. And you also have a traditional red brick farm building at approximately 5,500 square feet. Given the location, I was completely blown away when I came up here. You're completely secluded. The location lends itself to 3 good-sized, secluded residential units. That farmhouse is grade 2 listed. The barn beside it is curtilage listed. And the other thing is, we're going to go for Class Q here. We just thought this is the way to get a residential unit on this site here. And we were just, umming and ahhing as to whether this would be seen as curtilage listed, which would then mean that we couldn't get a Class Q prior approval on it. However, we looked at it, we measured it, we looked at how the curtilages work, and we thought this is separate enough from the farmhouse to go for an application. 2 weeks prior to when the decision was due, they issued a positive decision with only 4 planning conditions, so it was good. The key with a Class Q application is being robust as possible with what you're doing, and also keep it as simple as possible using the building. For instance, this one we're in, we know that the principal views and elevation is down to the south. However, we had to work with what we have here. We have these open bays, so the glazing and the front door and everything had to be this way, because we didn't want to give the council any wriggle room as to say that this barn wasn't going to be Class Q compliant. The site used to be fed off a well, however, that's probably no longer serviceable. So currently the water supply is from a separate farm, and an alkaline pipe runs above land. However, that wasn't going to be obviously good enough to service 3 residential units. So what we did prior to marketing the site on the open market, we sought quotes for sinking boreholes up here, so we could sort of put it to people that, yes, this is currently without a water supply. However, this is roughly what it's going to cost to put one in.
Well, this area of the estate used to be sort of integral to a farming tenancy several years ago. That tenancy was then taken back by us around about 25 years ago. And these buildings, there wasn't anybody living there at the time once the previous family had moved out. And we've really sort of kept them sound, kept the roofs on, but today they're not really fit for purpose for modern agricultural use. And it seemed like a good time to convert them to residential. There's a market at the moment for people moving out to this kind of area and wanting more space, particularly out of cities. It's gone up a lot, so the values of these places for residential conversion has really increased quite a bit, which made us think differently about perhaps developing it. If other people were thinking about doing a development like this on their farms, one of the things you have to think about, which is really key, is access. So the access up to here we will retain, and all of the land around it. The other thing, think about, perhaps if you've got to shoot, sporting rights, those are things that you have to think about. But really,
I think if you meet the people who are going to be developing it or taking it on, and you have a good understanding with them about what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, that's an important thing. Because also these buildings, they've been a part of your business or your estate for a long time. You want to make sure the right person is going to be looking after them. And even if you sort of take away our involvement, I think they're quite impressive looking buildings, and you want to see them brought back to some sort of form of glory.
Excellent, thanks ever so much. So Hazel, if we can come to you first. Kelvin mentioned in there the concept or something called Class Q. And for those that are on the call that might not know about Class Q, can you just chat us through what that means, please?
Yeah, so Class Q is from Part 3 of the General Permitted Development Order, and that is government legislation that sets out what you can do without the need for a full planning application. So the Class Q specifically allows for conversion and alterations from agricultural buildings to residential use, subject to a whole load of criteria with regards to the number of units, the floor space. But one of the key criteria is that the building from the outset has to be capable of conversion to a dwelling. So it needs to be structurally sound enough to be able to be converted without substantial reconstruction. So that obviously involves a subjective assessment, and we see quite a bit of variation between local authorities as to how they assess Class Qs, how robust they want the building to be, whether they allow more open-sided buildings or not. So it is quite a tricky area to navigate. Again, our advice is to speak to a planner if you're looking at converting a building, and we'll see what the options are. A structural survey is essential to prove the point that the building is capable of conversion without substantial work. And our advice really is to keep that conversion simple. So as we just saw in a video there, talking about making use of existing openings rather than creating whole new openings in the back of the building. So the important thing is to work with what you've got, keep it simple, at least to initially bank that Class Q consent, because once you've got a Class Q consent, then you've established the principle of a residential use in an area that may not otherwise be supported. And from there may be a potential to move on from that with potentially an application using that as a fallback.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Kelvin also mentioned that Wood Farm was home to several listed buildings. How much of a problem can listed buildings be? I mean, again, it's an area that we receive a lot of inquiries about at the CLA. We have on sort of heritage inquiries, we have lots of guidance notes on our website for anybody who'd like to download them or again contact the office. But listed buildings, curtilage listing, it's sort of a bit of a grey area that, there's sort of no definitive definition or anything like that. So how can sort of people manage that if they do have listed buildings and they're looking to do a scheme like this, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, listed buildings and curtilage listed buildings is definitely a constraint for Class Q, because it means you're not eligible for a Class Q conversion. So you'll always need full planning permission for that. And obviously it's a constraint in terms of the costs involved in the repair and the restoration work, the workmanship, the materials, etc. has a cost implication. But it can be an opportunity. If you've got listed buildings that need to have a long-term viable use, then a conversion to a residential or a commercial type scheme will bring that building back into use and secure its long-term retention. And that can be an opportunity. And we do have sites coming forward where we're looking at other opportunities to enhance the setting of the buildings. So it's not always a problem, it's just understanding that problem and working with it. So our advice really on that is to liaise with a heritage consultant from an early stage of the project and understand the importance and the significance of those buildings and any opportunities that you have. Curtilage listing is a bit of a minefield. In that sense, you don't have a building that is specifically listed in its own right. This refers to buildings that predate July 1948, which is when the planning system came into force. And if they are within the curtilage of a listed building, then they are also, by virtue, listed as well. And curtilage is where the problems arise. And that there's a Historic England guidance notes on this, but essentially it comes down to an assessment of your physical layout of the buildings, the ownership of those buildings, and the use and the function, both currently and at the time that the building was listed. And if it was listed before 1969, then they take that date. So there's a lot of specific matters to consider with regards to Curtilage listing. And again, that's where the heritage expertise comes in. And we work with quite a few heritage consultants on sites where we're looking to convert listed buildings.
Excellent. And the CLA, Jonathan Thompson is our heritage advisor. So if anybody, any members want to seek advice on that, then we can put you in touch with Jonathan. So please do get in touch. Angus, obviously we were looking at Class Q concept there. So those being permitted development rights, but obviously you can sort of go for new build residential and from a strategic point of view. Do you have any advice for members in relation to that side of things at all?
Yes, potentially, and I've spotted on the chat a question about is it possible to get a Class Q and then reapply to knock down the barn and build a house from scratch? And the answer is potentially yes. Sometimes it takes 3 steps. We've done a number, and so that's one example where you can end up with new build. It is ambitious, don't get me wrong. We have had battles on it. The secret is not to let the local authority know that that's necessarily what you have in mind. More often than not, it isn't what people have in mind. More often than not, they find once they've got the Class Q, actually it's going to cost so much to do. And sometimes buyers can't get a mortgage because of the nature of the Class Q consent. So there can be other reasons, you know, that drive that need. From a residential perspective, it's a question of is the proposal consistent with a plan policy? It might be a neighbourhood plan policy. We've got a number of allocations through neighbourhood plan policies. It might be a local plan policy. It might be consistent with an adopted local plan that allows for infill in one of the larger villages, one of the ones that's considered to be sustainable. They're often put into categories. Or it might be a promotion, as touched on earlier, a larger scale promotion next to an existing town, city settlement of a suitable scale, or even a standalone sustainable garden village, garden town, and we're involved in a number of schemes of all scales. But my role for the last couple of decades has been involved in the larger scale schemes. So it's plenty of opportunities out there, and it's understanding what the opportunities are before spending too much money heading in any particular direction.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Again, for any members interested, we do have an advisory handbook on a landowner's guide to rural housing, which is available. So we have further advice there. Okay, if we move on to our third case study now, this is from a commercial point of view. And this relates to a rural business park in Hertfordshire. This is West Wickham Hall, and CLA member David HARVEY has successfully converted a range of listed relevant farm buildings into a high-end rural business park.
Some time ago, we decided that the future of farming was mixed, and what we wanted to do was diversify our business and in so doing, rebalance our business from being a capital strong, income poor business to one that has a bit of both. So the next essential part of the process was to do an audit, looking at what you've got, what you think is possible given where you are, and then be as lateral minded as possible to think of all the alternatives and be prepared to make some compromises, because everything comes at a cost. The original plan was to have a very high quality business park, which would be partly customer facing and partly on an office or a business basis as well. So fortunately, that's more or less how it's turned out.
We sort of first got involved on the site sort of early 2000s, and at that point the site was focused on these 2 buildings, and there were a range of old Dutch barns, post-war agriculture development to the rear. The Grade 2 listed thatch barn behind us, that was in a really poor state and quite decrepit. David was looking to resurrect the 2 buildings, get an alternative use for them, but also maximise the potential of the site, which was always going to be a real challenge because we're in the greenbelt. English Heritage have a policy which is known as enabling development, whereby if you have a heritage asset where the effective value is less than 0, then you can have new build development to bring the scheme up to viability, to bring your land value effectively up to the point of viability. That's what we looked at here, because the thatch barn to my left was in such a bad state that the financial viability was such that we needed to have some new build development in order to be able to bring the development forward, and that these barns weren't suitable for residential conversion because of the amount of thatch and the lack of light and ventilation to the first floor. It would have been marginal to get them into residential use. It was a massive challenge from the planning side, which was obviously my responsibility, but then my colleague James has worked very hard on the commercial side with David to build a really vibrant commercial location that is a real draw for tenants, and they really want to be here. And the main planning challenges were in Greenbelt. In order to get any kind of new build in the Greenbelt, you've got to have hit one of the appropriate development heads, or you've got to have very special circumstances, and in this case the very special circumstances were the heritage value of the buildings. We had quite a series of quite complicated ecology issues, so we had some rare bat species and we had newts. We had quite a challenging surface water drainage issue, and surface water drainage is becoming more and more of an issue for a lot of developments now, and the need to provide attenuation and control runoff from sites. We had some interesting highways issues, which were resolved relatively straightforwardly, but they were to do with the access. But again, that's a very common issue for a lot of schemes. I think if you've got a good strategy and a good vision, and you can really sell the principles, then you help the local authority officers and the councillors to properly understand why you're doing what you're doing. And whilst it can be obvious to the landowner and to those involved in the industry why things need to happen and what changes you're trying to make, it's easy to forget that for councillors and officers, they don't have a background in the situations landowners find themselves in, and they don't understand the issues necessarily. And if you can take the councillors and the officers with you, that really helps to take a balanced view of the issues that might come up during the planning application process.
We're building multi-generational businesses, hopefully. That's something that's hopefully going to be my children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren. And if that's the case, then we need to build buildings which will not be redundant in a number of years' time. We are in quite advanced conversations with the council at a very high level, both at officer level and at council member level, because they've now understood what we're doing. There's another incredibly important part of what we've done, and this has accelerated massively in the last year, was to start engaging with the local council and the local councillors. And the lead planning officer for the local area has been around the site with me and his deputy and one other, and members of the Saunders team. And we were able to start talking about our vision for the site.
Great, excellent, thank you. Angus, if we come to you first, one of the first points that David made there was about understanding your assets really and undertaking a sort of audit of what you have. Is that something that obviously you'd recommend and that you do with your clients at the very outset of a proposal, just to understand what they have and what would work and what wouldn't work, and perhaps for what reasons?
Absolutely, yes, and it's not just a question of looking at it on a site level. It's worth looking at it in the wider context. So, at a site level, one would start with a constraints plan and look at all the planning constraints and all the physical constraints. But there are other constraints that can arise from the setting and alternative uses to the farm. Will the access be shared, as it is in that case with other development? And understanding that setting and how it fits within the farm business or the farming estate is important. So the other thing to look at is sort of an holistic approach within a whole estate. So a whole estate plan or a rural asset management plan, and there's some useful information on the CLA website about that, just to understand how it will fit. And there can be synergy between different uses. So there's on the video you saw there's a cafe there, Rosie Lee's Cafe, which high quality. It's a high quality one, and it's a setting for a high quality destination. So it adds to the attraction of that site to potential tenants, and it's all part of the judgment as to which is the best direction to take any given scheme in.
Absolutely. And yeah, Angus mentioned that we do have the Rural Asset Management Plan booklet. So this is a guide for those of you who wanted a starting point to create or undertake an asset audit. There's a guide, which is that booklet there, and then also online we have a template as well. So again, if you just search for Rural Asset Management Plan on our website, the 2 links should come up and login is required. But if not, do give us a call in the office and we can send it across to you. Hazel, Claire mentioned in there about designations and also particularly this site being in the green belt and the concept of very special circumstances. Can you just talk us through what that means? Because I'm sure there's many members on the call that are perhaps subject to green belt or other designations which can affect what they can do.
So we discussed earlier the idea of the principle of development, and in the green belt, national policy, the NPPF, and as repeated in lots of local plans, specifies exactly what is an appropriate development in the green belt. And if you don't comply with one of those specific forms of use or development, then your development is inappropriate and by virtue harmful to the green belt. So where you're faced with a proposal that is inappropriate development, you then need to look at very special circumstances. And it is what it sounds, it's very special, it's a very high hurdle to overcome. And the wording is that those very special circumstances must clearly outweigh the harm by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm. So anything else that arises in terms of harm and openness, etc., all gets thrown into this planning balance. And a very subjective assessment is made as to how that balance falls. Do those very special circumstances clearly outweigh the harm? So in this case, I think we'll probably move on to discuss things like enabling development in the historic buildings, but it is a very high hurdle.
Absolutely. And in fact, Claire did mention in the video regarding the concept of enabling development, that might be a concept that perhaps some members haven't come across before. Can you just chat us through what that might mean, and if it's an opportunity for members perhaps, and what hurdles they might have to overcome to achieve that?
Yeah, so enabling development, again, another high hurdle and complicated process, is all to do with a heritage asset that is in need of repair, restoration, etc. And the idea is that you have a viability and financial appraisal of all the works that are required to bring that building back to use. And where there's a conservation deficit in terms of your land values, that some additional development may be approved to balance that out. And that's development that wouldn't normally necessarily be approved in that location. So an example here, we are in the green belt. You wouldn't normally have new housing approved or new commercial buildings. So the original consent on this site for some new build dwellings was as an enabling development to justify the works to derelict barns on the site. And importantly, it doesn't apply to any deliberate neglect, and that this very clear about the condition of the building and how it's got in that condition. So you do need to be very careful there. Yes, it is. It's also set out in national policy, and another useful Historic England guidance note on that one as well.
Perfect, excellent. Just turning to sort of some of the issues that Claire mentioned cropped up in terms of the planning process as they were going along, and some of the issues that were flagged. She mentioned surface water drainage problems, and this is now becoming kind of a more and more of a problem for developments. Can you just explain about that further and how these perhaps might be overcome? Are they, is it kind of a deal breaker, or are there things that one can do to overcome those issues?
Yes, so surface water drainage is becoming more and more important as we're looking at climate change, sustainability, etc. And I think legislation, the planning policies are quite clear with regards to major sites, which are 10 or more houses and larger scale developments. But we are seeing it creeping in more and more now on your minor developments, which is 1 to 9 houses or smaller commercial schemes. And we have a number of local plans with policies specifically requiring sustainable urban drainage requirements for smaller scale developments. And that means there's a hierarchy for SUDs, sustainable urban drainage. And really what they're looking for is surface water, swales, and improvements to biodiversity at the same time. So it's not just piping your drainage back underground and hiding it. It's about exposing your drainage and using it to create other advantages. And it does vary depending on the local authority and their local plan policy, and also their application of the policies. Some local authorities have the policies and don't seem to follow them to the letter. So it's understanding the local authority in the area that you're working with, and understanding the site, because if you're anticipating this being an issue, then you really need to factor it in from an early stage in the design and development process, because you need to understand your topography, your connections, etc., before you start forming any kind of master plan or layout.
Absolutely. Perfect, thank you. And Angus, another problem that both Will mentioned in the previous video and in this video was sort of in relation to access and highways. And again, that's a key consideration for many developments, regardless of scale. So do you have sort of any advice or tips in terms of how to deal with that, and what people are looking for in terms of the local authority and what they're looking at, and how, you know, that should be approached by members?
Yes, absolutely. There's the site-specific advice, and then there's more general advice. So the general advice is to understand your access. Typically, if the scheme is looking viable and you're getting to the stage where you're spending money on third-party work, getting a topographic survey so you can understand your sight lines, understanding the highway network you're joining, the point you wish to join. Many cases, it's much easier if one is using an existing access, because that you don't then need planning for the principle of putting a new access in, which adds an extra hurdle. But there are occasions when it can actually be useful to put a new access in, because you can put it in where there are better sight lines. And sometimes, if there's an existing access that is considered to be dangerous, but it's established use, and the local authority or the highways authority have got no right to shut it down, there's a trade-off. You can provide a net improvement to highway safety as well as increasing traffic. So it's understanding the capacity of the road you're joining as well. And then if you find you have a deficient access, considering what the alternatives are. So it's no good going to present a scheme to the local authority before you've understood the problems. Sometimes the solutions can involve an alternative approach. So it's well worth fully understanding all the issues before you start to bottom out what scheme you're going to take forward.
Absolutely. So Wickham Hall, as we've seen, is a very successful sort of rural business park. Many complementary businesses there side by side. William Morton in the first video also mentioned sort of doing farm tours off the back of his environmental stewardship schemes for his visitors to the glamping pods. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts really around sort of creating a destination and placemaking and that side of things. Design, for example, the government consulted earlier this year on the National Design Code, and the NPPF has been updated to sort of incorporate some of the recommendations which have come out of various government reports in relation to design and beauty and that side of things. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that side of things, and how important it is now to kind of incorporate those considerations into a planning application, regardless of what it's for.
Certainly there are a lot of applications that benefit hugely from considering the placemaking. Is it a destination? As you say, both the Mortons and the Harveys considered that the Wickham Hall site in particular for a high quality destination for the end users, and how that can be improved and then enhanced with various phases, adding to what's already there and enhancing it. In terms of placemaking, yes, placemaking can mean different things to different people. We use it a lot in the context of large scale strategic site delivery. And particularly when one's delivering a new either sustainable urban extension or a new community, garden village, garden town. And it's a question of making it a place that people want to live, so that you put in your infrastructure, and particularly your green infrastructure and your schools and your community facilities before you start, and with a lot of planting and thinking very carefully about design and design codes. So a lot of our schemes are on behalf of landowners who wish to, retain, they have an estate next to the development. It's being carved out of part of their holding, and they wish to retain a significant degree of control. So we have sold parcels. We've overseen the planning process and then sold parcels to developers. That puts some quite draconian constraints in terms of finishes, even down to window, fenestration, roof treatments, etc. And in terms of the value, we have found, and we've had house builders who've said, oh, we're not going to bid for that if you insist on that when we start, because it doesn't tick the standard box that they'd like to build. And I've had house builders come back to me afterwards when they've sold the houses at a premium. We've had one house builder who's actually changed the design of their houses because of the restrictions we put on one particular scheme, where they did so well that they've upgraded that product as a result. So yes, placemaking and considering the overall value it adds is particularly important for most schemes one considers.
Absolutely. And again, our CLA handbook, CLA 90 on rural housing, covers some of those elements that Angus was just talking about. And also there is some very helpful information on placemaking if that's sort of what you're interested in design on the Prince's Foundation, on HOH Prince of Wales Prince's Foundation website. So many reports on there to have a look at if that's of interest to you. Thanks ever so much, Hazel and Angus. I think we've had a great discussion. That's very interesting. Hopefully some interesting points come out of there for members. Nick, I think we're now moving on to Q&A, is that right?
That's correct, yes. Thank you very much indeed. And gosh, there's been a lot of information coming at us, so a lot of stuff to think about. I'm glad this has been recorded. We've had a few questions that have come in. The first one is from Tony Alston. It says, given that planning actually takes about 12 months, not 2, and that summer is only 2 months for camping caravans, please comment on the dangers of getting on with proper toilets, etc., and getting retrospective planning permission. I think this is probably a permitted development right question. So who would like to take that? Alison or Angus? Angus, he's off.
Well, now Alison can volunteer. I'm happy to just say a few words. Yes, because if it's retrospectively being considered, then viability is everything. So you need to understand what your costs are to commitment, and I should have probably touched on that earlier. In terms of understanding your constraints, services and the cost of servicing a site is a constraint. And people can be very surprised to bring an electricity supply. It may be a few £1000s. It may be many, many tens of thousands of pounds. Similar thing with water. So understanding drainage, whether you can deliver it on site. So absolutely, it's very important to understand that if you're committing to something that has a limited window to obtain an income from, like a camping caravan site.
Yeah, sorry, go on, Hazel, go on.
I was just going to cover just the point about risk there, that if it's retrospective that you're going for, the application would be assessed against exactly the same policies as if it's proposed. So just because it's retrospective, the council shouldn't look at it any differently in terms of the policy background and the policy position. It's a risk at the end of the day. If you're committing to those additional costs, and if the planning application were refused, then obviously you may be at risk of enforcement action. So it's understanding how supportive the council might be, speaking to a planner about it, and then understanding what that risk is that you're taking on.
It's probably worthwhile, if you're trying for the first time, perhaps hiring in portable facilities, which are pretty good these days. You can get some quite upmarket things if you just try and do a 2-month under permitted development rights on your land for camping or caravanning.
Yeah, that's what many members who are using these 56 days camping rules are doing this year and last year as well. So yeah, that's what we're seeing from the membership.
Thanks so much. Charlie McNichols has asked about quite a decent, detailed question about a farm in the southwest appealed and overturned a denial to knock a farm building down and build a new residential build through Class Q ? Does this now set a national precedent, and can we use it particularly in North Norfolk? And I'm not quite sure whether anyone knows about this case, but if you do, it'd be good to have your views.
I don't know about Angus or Hazel. I'm not sure of that case. Do either of you two know?
I'm not familiar with that, but I've done my own successful fallback planning application once securing a Class Q consent, and it really is just it depends on the local authority. There's quite a few appeal decisions now where full planning applications for new build houses have been approved in place of a Class Q. And from my perspective, it's really about setting a case of benefits. So if you're showing an overall reduction in volume and size of the building, but keeping the general sort of form and character of it as an agricultural building, and showing whatever additional enhancements and improvements that you can will all strengthen your case to try and make that justification, but it's not straightforward.
Might just add, as we've got offices in Taunton and South West and in Norfolk on the Hockham estate, it would be an interesting case. So we will research that one.
Thank you very much.
We will.
Okay, there's a couple of questions now on Class Q. The first one, which actually was touched on in one of the films, was can we still get a Class Q if a building is no longer structurally sound? That's from Terence Thorogood on the Sotley estate. And William Sonnex has said, how will the new planning paper affect landowners? Will Class Q survive? And that's quite a bit of speculation. So perhaps you could comment on the structure, what structural elements. I think generally it's just as long as the frame's structural, because quite everything else has to go, doesn't it, really, for Class Q?
Yeah, I can comment on that. Yeah, if it's not structurally sound, you are going to struggle with a Class Q, even in the most generous of local authorities. And what you do need to also be careful of is if you're carrying out repairs to an agricultural building, to the extent that it counts as development under your agricultural permitted development rights, then that can compromise your rights to a Class Q for a period of 10 years. So if you start replacing walls and the roof or various structural elements of the building to make it structurally sound to benefit from the Class Q, they've cottoned on to that, and that means that you would lose those Class Q rights for a period of 10 years. So before carrying out any works to a building that might have some Class Q potential, speak to a planner and just try and establish the best way forward if there is an opportunity there.
And whether any of us can actually speculate on whether Class Q will survive or not, I think certainly the CLA will be lobbying hard to make sure it does, because it's been a huge benefit to many members. But
yeah, I think there's a clear focus for sort of housing. I think it's clear that the government are, woken up to that fact, and their ambitions in terms of delivering housing are very much there at the fore. So obviously Class Q does help that with the conversion to residential. The CLA were instrumental in getting Class Q in the first place. So yes, it would definitely be something that we'll be strongly defending if there was any suggestion at all that it might not survive for any reason. But I think the fact that it does relate to housing, yeah, hopefully, and the government's ambitions in relation to that, hopefully that will survive.
It's no good asking me for a prediction, because I've been warning people that since about the summer of 2013 that it may not last very long, and it's worth considering the opportunities and moving on them. So I've been wrong for so long now that I will probably continue being wrong with any luck.
We have another question that's just come in on Class Q. Have you any experience of a Class R alongside a Class Q, and any limits on the total application footprint? I mean, if you cover that generally, I mean, this might be something that actually we could answer in more detail directly to Skeltons if they want to send an email into the office. But
yeah, I can just cover it briefly though, on the basis that the Class R is the permitted development right for a change of use from agricultural to flexible commercial uses. So instead of residential, it's commercial, and that's subject to 500 square metre floor space limit and a range of other criteria as well. So it is a separate class within the Part 3. And I haven't any experience of doing it myself yet, but I have suggested on a site that the building would be eligible for Class Q and Class R. So they're not mutually exclusive. So you should be able to have your maximum of, you could get up to 865 square metres under a Class Q for up to 5 dwellings, and then up to 500 square metres on your Class R. But they are both subject to a prior approval application, and that's where you may encounter some issues with regards to things like transport and highway impacts and noise, etc., and the relationship between those uses. So in theory, yes, in detail probably requires a bit more investigation.
Many thanks indeed, Hazel. And in fact, I'm afraid we've now run out of time. I'm sure there's lots of other things we could discuss at great length, but thank you very much indeed, Alison, Hazel and Angus. And it's a hugely complex issue, and it's where we'd advise every CLA member to take advice as early as possible and start to plan your planning in advance of putting in your planning consent. So if you could do that. We're going to put up a slide with some upcoming events. I hope you've enjoyed this afternoon, found it useful. And if you have any further questions, do contact the office. And as I say, there will be a recording available of this webinar. So thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday afternoon. Many thanks. Goodbye.